Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, House Bill 1607 addresses transmission infrastructure and grid reliability in Texas. Our power grid is constantly changing. We invest in it to meet shifting demands. The current Texas power grid, however, is not evolving fast enough to keep pace with the demands of our economy and projected population growth. The lack of transmission availability to deliver electricity to homes and businesses will continue to aggravate our electricity market without new reforms. Constraints, congestion, and generation curtailments present an ever-growing reliability and resiliency problem for the ERCOT power grid. An expensive hidden cost that is passed on to consumers and a competitive disadvantage for our economy, for example, in lost and devalued construction projects. Transmission congestion cost Texans nearly $1.5 billion in 2020, and in just the first 3 months of 21, it has already cost our state $850 million due to trapped low-cost power that cannot get to market. House Bill 1607 is to improve the efficiency of our transmission system, to ease congestion, and prepare for future reliability. This improves ERCOT transmission planning and processing and expedites some of the grid infrastructure projects for shorter term. In short, this bill will benefit communities and industries from the Permian to the coast and all our urban centers. We need to act now, and House Bill 1607 does that.
Mr. Tinderholt, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for some questions, please?
Yes. Gentleman yield for questions. Gentleman yields.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. So I want to kind of run through this bill really quick. There's two real sections to it, and I'm going to try to be kind of generic when I say that. There's a findings section, and then there's an execution section. Is
Correct.
that fair?
Yes.
So in the findings, I'm going to run through each of the 8 findings, and I'm going to go through them. I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can. Finding number 1 is that the state has long been a leader in energy policy that's delivered economic electricity and environmental benefits to millions of electricity consumers, businesses, state-owned lands, and landowners. Is it fair to say that the state, the PUC, and ERCOT weren't really leaders in that because of some of the things we failed to do in the past in delivering electricity to consumers in the past, not in the future?
Yeah, exactly. We've seen the failure to properly plan and provide for this growing state and this growing grid, and I think in February we saw the effects of that.
So when I read number 2, there's a finding that says this state continues to experience population, business, industrial, and manufacturing growth that increases the need for reliable, low-cost electricity. As for number 2, I agree that we need reliable energy. We don't have enough of that right now. Would you agree that our constituents would prefer we focus on less tangential transmission issues and more increasing reliable electric generation so they can count on the power when they need it and they flip the switch?
We all want reliable energy, but this bill, 1607, is not about generation. It is about transmission. It's trying to get generated capacity from parts of this state that have that ability, but it's needed in other parts of the state.
Correct, and I'm going to get to that. I'm going to go through, but I'll just tell you ahead of time. Where I'm going is that wind and solar oftentimes put their power generation far from the need of where the demand is, and it's very expensive, and we, the people, including my constituents, they pay for those lines, and that's kind of where I'm going. Number 2 specifically mentions low-cost electricity. Transmission lines are paid for by Texans, not the generators. Even if those generators have chosen to poorly place their wind turbines and solar farms far, far from where the demand is. CREZ lines will already have cost Texans $14 billion by the end of the next decade. Do you agree it would be fairer to our constituents to place that cost on generators instead? And what I mean by that is that they have to put those generation plants closer to where the demand is so that we aren't paying and constituents aren't paying for transmission lines because they poorly sited them. They put them in poor locations.
Of course, generation, this bill does not control where generation is. This bill controls where the transmission lines are that will take that generation to market. Those are economic situations that this bill does not address.
And as I go, I'm going to get through all 8 of them. Number 3 is the ERCOT electric grid is experiencing congestion, constraint, and curtailment that are economically undesirable. Where is ERCOT grid facing congestion and constraint?
Where are they facing? All over the state. There's some 15 congestion zones in this state. They're called generic transmission constraints, and they're all over this state.
It's my understanding that the primary effect of adding more transmission will just put more wind and solar electricity on the grid, when that's not what we need. You're trying to fix the movement of the power. This leads to market distortions, including negative pricing, and makes it harder for reliable thermal generators to cover their costs. Why are the tax ratepayers paying to prop up one form of generation over another?
I'm sorry I didn't hear all of that, but I will tell you this bill is not about generation. This
well,
is about
grid, if you really dig
process.
deep in the bill and you look at it, really this bill is about wind and solar. ERCOT Electric Power Grid is experiencing load growth management is number 4. I think 4.5 million Texans would agree with this finding. But to be clear, we're not experiencing...
Members, please take your conversations outside the rail.
We're not experiencing growth in reliable thermal generation, even though our population and economy demand it. Would you agree with that?
We have generation in certain parts of the state. What this bill is doing is trying to get that generation to the parts of the state that needs it.
Correct, but it's helping wind and solar who poorly site their generation equipment far away, and then it costs the ratepayers the money to have to pay for that extra load. Number 5 and 6 says, while the state does not import large amounts of electricity, working to ensure that this state's electricity needs are met as fully possible from in-state resources is of strategic interest to the legislature. Number 6, we're almost done, we're going to get to 8. All of the electric power industry's available power generation resources, including its wind and solar generation, natural gas-fired generation, energy storage, and transmission components, can play a substantial role in this state's economic recovery. My question is, it seems to me that wind and solar make up 33% of our grid, but they produce well below that in terms of electricity generated. The week of the blackouts, they produced 8% of our electricity, despite making up 1/3 of our capacity. At one point during the blackouts, wind and solar's production fell as low as 1.5% of our electricity. How much are we going to have to pay? How long are we going to have to keep paying for wind and solar?
You know, wind and solar, and again, you keep trying to make this bill about wind and solar. It's not. This is about getting generative capacity to parts of the state that don't have that service available. They are paying higher prices because of the lack of access to lower cost generation.
But it's about transmission, and we're paying for the transmission lines. And the transmission lines, when these guys continue to poorly site and place their wind and solar in horrible locations, you and I and our constituents are paying for the transmission lines that are miles and miles long when they could be placed closer. Number 6 refers to several electric generation options, but leaves out 2 of our most reliable sources, nuclear and clean coal, as well as other important renewable resources like hydropower. In order to not appear to be playing favorites, would you accept an amendment to correct that and include all energy? This is just in the findings, sir.
This finding, as you said, is only a recitation. It does not control the bill. The bill is about the process of looking at transmission in this state and expediting that process.
Let me go through number 7 and 8, and then I'll get away from the mic here. Number 7, this state's oil and natural gas industries continue to grow and prosper, and those industries require low-cost electricity and a reliable power grid to thrive. Those 2 words are important, low cost and reliable electric. Number 8, to attract new capital projects to this state, create jobs, promote substantial new economic development, ensure a reliable and stable electric power grid that's powered by in-state resources, and keep this state as a leader on energy policy in the U.S. A timely and targeted expansion of the state's electric transmission system, which is paid by the ratepayers, is necessary to enhance the reliability of the system. When you say in-state, are you referring to American and Texas products or Chinese-made products like solar panels and wind components?
You know, you keep trying to make this about wind and solar.
Where did this bill originate?
I'm sorry?
Where did the bill originate? Who wrote the bill? Who brought the bill?
I filed this bill before the storm in February. I filed this bill in early February. I have seen these constraints happen. I have seen congestion costs play out to consumers throughout this state. I have seen wonderful projects go by the board because of these constraints that are placed on it because lack of capacity.
Mr. Speaker, can we get order?
I'm sorry?
They can't hear you. Can they get order, please? I want you to be heard as well.
Members, please take your conversations outside the rail. We're having trouble hearing the debate.
This bill was brought, I had this bill drafted and filed in early February before the winter storm. This bill is necessary because I have seen, certainly in West Texas and throughout Texas, in Dallas, in Houston, in South Texas, in the Valley, where you have areas of this state that need the benefit of low-cost electricity that are not able to achieve that benefit because of lack of transmission capability. And so this bill is directed to try to improve that situation. There are no new lines proposed. These are all lines that have been identified by ERCOT in their long-term planning process as necessary to relieve the transmission constraints that are currently in place in this state.
Okay, I have two more questions. ERCOT says transmission congestion had a negligible impact on the blackouts. So this proposal, while it's not a horrible proposal, it doesn't solve the problems we faced in February and that we're going to face again in this summer. Do you think that we should focus on reliable capacity? Do you think that we should increase capacity?
Certainly reliability is an issue, but this bill is about, during the winter storm, there was nearly 5,000 megawatts stranded in the valley. You had generation that could have fueled some 1 million homes, Texas homes, and it was trapped in the valley because of lack of transmission capability. That's what this bill is about. That's what I'm trying to protect, making sure we have a minimum number of Texas households that are without power when they need it the most.
Just so you know, I don't disagree that we need to clean up transmission. I just don't like how the cost of transmission is happening, where ratepayers are are paying when the the power generators, often it's usually solar and wind, are doing it miles and miles away from where the power needs to be, where the demand is. And so I want to tell you, I have 4 amendments that I hope you'll consider, some or all, and literally it comes down to each of these amendments is protecting the ratepayers, our constituents. I'm not in a place where I want to fight over the transmission because I agree. Sometimes transmission stuff probably does get clogged up. But every one of these things that I'm going to do right now after this are to protect your ratepayers or constituents and mine as well. So I'm going to move to the front and do those layouts really quick, and I hope you'll consider them, sir.
Okay.
Following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Patterson.
Chair recognizes Mr. Patterson to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a significant problem on our electricity grid, and it's been decades in the making. And it's because of the proliferation of wind power on our electricity grid. You see, wind power competes at such an advantage over traditional, reliable, dispatchable sources of electricity because of the sheer number of subsidies that are given to them at every level of government. Wind power breaks even at negative 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour. Negative 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour is where wind breaks even. We grow by 1,000 people a day in Texas. And as the speaker says, they're not bringing asphalt or schools with them. They're also not bringing thermal generation with them. Our economy continues to grow by leaps and bounds over almost any other economy in the world. Yet thermal generation has not invested in our state in years. And it's because they can't make a profit doing so. They can't compete with highly subsidized wind power that quite frankly isn't there when you need it to be. This bill is broken into essentially 2 sections. And the first section is kind of like a resolution. And I'm sure that there have been resolutions before this body that you have voted against in the past. Things that you just can't agree with, can't get on board with. I have an amendment to this section of the bill, and I'm not looking to change anything substantially in the meat of the bill in the second section. But this first section of the bill, the resolution type piece of the bill that says that the legislature finds, this isn't some study, this isn't a state agency, this is those of us in this room, that we find these certain things to be true. And quite frankly, I just don't believe that these things are true. So I'm looking to just strike a few words and to add a couple of words. The first is on page 1, line 12, where I'm striking the word reliable, and then I'm adding in reliable and dispatchable. Because quite frankly, wind shows up when it can, and when it's not, we're out of luck. We need reliable and dispatchable power, and I think that that's what we should all agree to here. On page 1, line 17, between challenges and the semicolon, I'm talking about those challenges being due to the proliferation of wind power in this state. On page 1, line 23,
Ms. Weiner, for what purpose?
I rise on a point of order against further consideration of the Patterson Amendment under Rule 11, Section 3, that it changes the original purpose of the bill.
Bring your point of order down front.
The point of order has been withdrawn. The chair recognizes Representative Patterson to continue on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Got to find where I was. On page 2, between components and the word can, that sentence actually reads that all of the electric power industry's available power generation resources, including its wind and solar generation, natural gas-fired generation, energy storage, and transmission components, and I would add, not including wind generation, can play a substantial role in the state's economic recovery. Because quite frankly, by adding this amendment, it is now a true statement. Ladies and gentlemen, I would just ask that you stand with me on this section of the bill, which again does not change the meat of what Representative Darby is trying to do here, but it is a statement that this legislature believes in what the first section here says.
Mr. Harless, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
Are you just
Gentleman
changing
yields.
a few words?
We're just changing a few words.
Thank you.
Thank you. I move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Darby to speak against the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, clearly Representative Patterson has a passion. Passion is to limit wind and solar, and certainly he's entitled to that perspective. But this bill is not about generation. This bill is about transmission and the process of transmission, and how do we evaluate transmission, where do we need transmission, where do we have constraints, where do we have congestion costs. All of that is important. And so while I told him he's welcome to talk about something that's very passionate to him, but in the end, the findings in this bill I think are important, and I think I would urge the members of this body to reject this amendment. I'm going to oppose this amendment and would ask your support in that regard.
The chair recognizes Representative Patterson to close on the amendment.
Members, the first part of this bill is not substantial law that we are trying to put into place. The first section of this bill is a statement on if you believe that wind power is to the substantial benefit of the state of Texas economically, and actually what the statement currently says is that it's not even harming us. And we all know that that's not true. So I would ask that you vote with me and support the amendment, or vote with my colleague Representative Zwiener against the amendment.
The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. A record vote has been requested by Representative Zwiener. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote nay. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Darby voting no. Show Mr. Patterson voting aye. Show Mr. Encina voting no. Show Mr. Kane voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 36 ayes, 104 nays, the amendment fails. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Tinderholt.
The chair recognizes Mr. Tinderholt on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I too am pretty passionate about this. And the first section is just findings. So we're going to change. What I'd like to do is include all power generation in those findings. It's really that simple. First Amendment is a word change. We're including all power generation in the findings. I move adoption.
Chair recognizes Mr. Darby in opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I'm going to oppose this amendment for some of the same reasons that we talked about with the Patterson Amendment. That's not the purpose of this bill, and we need to look at how we can make transmission to be a source and an asset for this state.
Chair recognizes Mr. Tinderholt to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Representative Darby. I respectfully disagree. I think all power generation is important. I believe that generation is just as important as the transmission. Therefore, I hope that you'll stay with me and vote 1 on this amendment. Thank you. Move adoption.
The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote nay. Division vote. Show Mr. Darby voting no. Show Mr. Murphy voting no. All voted. Strike the board. The amendment fails. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Tinderholt.
Chair recognizes Mr. Tinderholt on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Amendment 2, really, it begs the question, do ratepayers pay for all transmission costs regardless of where the power generation companies place their generation equipment? Or should the power generators be held accountable for placing the power generation equipment far from the demand because they don't care? It's subsidized because you, the ratepayer, and your constituents are going to pay for it. This finding modification would say that the legislature finds that power generators should bear the cost versus the socialist way we do it right now, where ratepayers pay for it all. After the blackouts that killed upwards of 111 people, Texan realized that power generation is just as important as the transmission. When you look at power generation, and you have natural gas, for instance, for every unit of natural gas, you have the reliability of knowing exactly what's going under the grid. I want to leave you, before you vote this amendment, I want to talk about my visit to ERCOT and what they told me when I was there, because I've authored the power grid bill every session. They told me that the biggest problem they have there is the unpredictability of wind and solar. They don't know how much sun they're going to have and how much wind there's going to be. Yes, it's power that's provided to the grid, but it's unpredictable. And so while this bill talks about transmission, we're also talking about the generation of that. In my eyes, this bill is subsidized transmission lines for the power generators, wind and solar, that place their power generation far, far, far from where the demand is, and you and your constituents pay for it. I move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Darby to speak against the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this bill is not where you cite generation. Generation is where the market conditions exist to justify it. There's over 7,000 megawatts of new thermal generation already on the books and in the planning stage here in Texas. My job and your job is to make sure that generation is able to get to the customers who need it. And so I appreciate what Representative Tinderholt is doing, but I'd ask you to stay with me and vote no on his amendment.
Chair recognizes Representative Tinderholt to close on the amendment.
I'm going to very respectfully, not disrespectfully. Hey, I've been pretty respectful this session. Anyway, I respectfully disagree, and I'm hoping that you'll vote with me on this, vote 1.
The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote nay. Division vote. Show Representative Darby voting no. Show Representative Tinderholt voting aye. Have all voted. Strike the board. The amendment fails. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Tinderholt.
The chair recognizes Representative Tinderholt to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, we have 2 more amendments, and I'll be very quick. The third amendment. This amendment requires the PUC to set economic costs and benefits to ratepayers as a criteria when considering whether to grant approval for a new transmission project. Since this bill has the potential to significantly increase transmission costs, costs which are borne by the generators, or not by generators, but by the taxpayers and the ratepayers, it's imperative that the new transmission will bring economic benefit in the form of lower electricity prices and greater reliability for ratepayers. This amendment will help ensure that the transmission projects resulting from this bill are not simply another subsidy to generators. Please vote yes for this if you want to keep costs low for your constituents.
Chair recognizes Representative Darby to speak against the bill or the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, members, this amendment in effect eliminates the ERCOT production cost savings test and replaces it with a test that this legislature rejected over 10 years ago. The consumer test is not defined. The amendment creates ambiguity. The previous consumer test produced only one transmission project, and it benefited industrial energy consumers. And with that, I'd move to oppose this amendment.
Chair recognizes Representative Tinderholt to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Look, it's pretty simple. This one is not in the findings of the bill. This is in the execution of the bill. Do you want higher or lower costs for your ratepayers and your constituents? Do you want wind and solar to have to move their power generation closer to the demand, or do you want them to be able to put it wherever they want with no constraints, and then we and our constituents pay for it? I move adoption and hope that you'll consider voting yes with me.
The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. A record vote has been requested by Representative Slayton. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote nay. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Representative Darby voting no. Show Representative Biederman voting aye. Show Representative Murphy voting no. Show Representative Tinderholt voting aye.
One more.
Have all voted? Have all voted? There being 31 ayes and 112 nays, the amendment fails. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Tinderholt.
Chair recognizes Representative Tinderholt to explain the amendment.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment requires the PUC to set an allowance for the interconnection costs and require generators to pay for the interconnection costs that exceed that allowance. For too long, Texas ratepayers have been required to foot the bill for transmission and interconnection costs, a policy which has led to many of the poor siting decisions and congestion issues that the bill is seeking to address. If we're going to bail out generators that have not properly sited or located their projects, then they should have to foot some of the bill. We cannot continue to give them a blank check at ratepayers and our constituents' expense. Please vote with me and give an allowance, and anything over that allowance the generators have to pay for, which makes them have to make good decisions on where to place them. Please vote yes with me.
Chair recognizes Mr. Darby to speak against the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. This amendment rejects 20 years of efficient market design with no study. This language regarding upgrades is very uncertain and potentially very costly. It will place new costs on generation projects, both renewal and thermal, increasing electricity costs to consumers. State Affairs has bills related to this issue, and they've not moved this issue in their committee. This is not a House floor issue, and with that, I'd ask you to reject this amendment.
The chair recognizes Mr. Tinderholt to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. We've had 4 amendments, and all 4 of them are good amendments. This amendment really protects your ratepayers and your constituents. Voting no on this says that you don't care, in my eyes, how much your constituents and ratepayers have to pay when they decide, the power generation companies decide, to put their power generation plants tens of miles away from where the demand is. It's significantly more expensive. The transmission costs go up significantly. So I'm hoping that you'll consider voting yes with this amendment.
Mr. Vasut, for what purpose? Mr. Vasut, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I will absolutely yield
The gentleman
for
yields.
questions.
Representative Tinderholt, this looks very familiar to me. I think this is my bill. Are you aware, if so, that the language in this provision passed the Senate already?
I am.
Okay. Thank you. I'll vote for it.
Thank you. I move adoption.
The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. A record vote has been requested by Representative Slayton. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote nay. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Darby voting no. Show Mr. Tinderholt voting aye. Have all voted? Have all voted? There being 37 ayes, 107 nays, the amendment fails. Is there anyone wishing to speak on, for, or against House Bill 1607? The chair recognizes Representative Darby to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, we've had enough of this issue on the floor today, and so I'm going to respectfully ask that you approve this bill. I think this will move transmission forward and move providing generation capacity from parts of the state that are not able to get to the parts of the state where we need that generation. And I want to thank you for your attention, and thank you for the use of the hall, and appreciate your support of the bill.
The question occurs on passage to engrossment of House Bill 1607. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and House Bill 1607 is passed to engrossment.